Empires rarely collapse at the moment they run out of strength. More often, they collapse later, after they have already begun borrowing against a future they can no longer truly secure. That is the darker pattern history keeps repeating. When conquest slows, when tax revenues weaken, when gold and silver are no longer enough to carry the weight of armies, borders, and political promises, power does not simply retreat. It looks for time, it looks for credit, it looks for a way to preserve the appearance of order a little longer. And that is where debt becomes more than finance. It becomes a bridge between fading strength and borrowed stability. A way for a state to keep paying soldiers, keep feeding cities, keep reassuring markets, keep pretending that the center still holds. But there is a question buried inside that illusion. If an empire needs to sell more and more of tomorrow just to survive today, is that a sign of power, or the first quiet confession of decline? This is not just the story of money, it is the story of how money reshapes trust, how debt reorganizes power, and how entire societies begin to feel the strain long before the flag falls. Debt can look like strength. On the surface, a state that can borrow heavily appears powerful, organized, even trusted. Credit seems to say that markets still believe, that armies can still be funded, that borders can still be defended, that order can still be maintained. But history is far less comforting than that. Again and again, large empires turned to debt, not at the height of real abundance, but at the moment when deeper supports were beginning to weaken. Tax flows slowed, metal reserves thinned, expansion lost momentum. The cost of holding everything together kept rising. And yet, the machinery of power could not simply stop, so borrowing stepped in where real strength no longer reached. Not as proof that the foundation was solid, but as proof that the foundation needed help. That is the paradox at the center of imperial finance. Debt often looks like confidence from the outside. From the inside, it can be the first sign that an empire is already living beyond the strength it still claims to possess. To understand why empires borrow before they decline, we have to stop thinking of debt as a financial product by itself. In history, debt matters because it extends power. Again and again, imperial order rests on three foundations. First, taxes the state's ability to draw real resources out of society. Second, money the credibility of the coins, notes, or payments that keep the system moving. Third, trust the belief that the center can still enforce order, honor obligations, and hold the structure together. As long as those three pillars are strong, an empire can absorb pressure. But when one begins to weaken, debt enters the story. When taxes no longer cover the cost of armies and administration. When money begins to lose substance or purchasing power. When trust starts thinning, in markets, in provinces, in daily exchange, debt becomes the bridge. It allows the state to keep functioning before the underlying weakness is fully visible. Not by solving the problem, but by postponing its consequences. That is the logic we will follow throughout this story. Rome helps us see the pattern early. An empire of that scale was never held together by glory alone. It had to feed legions, guard frontiers, pay officials, move grain, and keep distant provinces tied to the center. All of that required resources on a vast and continuous scale. And when pressure rose, Rome faced a familiar problem. Its obligations kept expanding faster than its stable foundations, so the empire leaned on its money. Over time, silver content in Roman coinage was reduced. The coin still carried the authority of the state. It still moved through markets, it still paid soldiers, but its substance was changing. Quietly, almost invisibly, the empire was stretching the value of its money in order to keep the machinery running. This was not public collapse. It was something more subtle, and in some ways more dangerous. Rome was pulling purchasing power forward. using weakened money to cover present costs that real strength no longer covered cleanly. Not debt in the modern bond market sense, no. But the same underlying logic was already there. When an empire cannot fully pay for the present, it begins borrowing from the future in whatever form it can. This is the first twist, and it matters. Empires do not usually die first on the battlefield. They die earlier, and more quietly, inside the systems that made battle possible in the first place. They weaken in their money, in their ability to pay, in the public's willingness to keep trusting what the state still claims is sound. That is what makes imperial decline so hard to recognize in real time. The banners may still fly, the army may still march, officials may still issue orders from the center. From a distance, power can look intact. But underneath, something more important has already started to fail. When coinage loses substance, when payments become harder to sustain, when trust begins to thin in markets and daily exchange, collapse has already entered the story long before walls are breached or capitals fall. That is the more unsettling truth Rome reveals. A civilization can appear strong even after its monetary core has begun to crack. And once that crack opens, the fall is no longer only military. It becomes social, financial, and psychological. If Rome shows the early pattern, the Dutch Republic shows the turning point. Here, debt became something new, not merely a sign of strain, and not merely a hidden weakening inside the currency. It became a system, a method, a political invention. In the 17th century, the Dutch were fighting a long and expensive war against Spain. War required ships, soldiers, fortifications, trade protection, and constant financing. But instead of relying only on treasure already in hand, the Dutch state learned to raise money by selling bonds to its own citizens. That changed everything. Now, future tax revenues could be pulled into the present in an organized, repeatable way. Credit was no longer just emergency relief. It became state technology. And because investors believed the Dutch Republic could tax, trade, and honor repayment, debt itself became a source of strength. It helped finance war, stabilize government, and deepen the bond between markets and state power. This was the dangerous breakthrough. Debt was no longer merely what states used when they were cornered. It was becoming the foundation on which durable power could be built. What made state debt so powerful was never the loan itself. It was the machinery behind it. A private borrower can promise future payment. A state can do far more. It can tax, it can compel. It can redefine legal obligations. And in many eras, it can weaken the currency or create more of it to keep payments moving. That changes the meaning of debt completely. Now, borrowing is no longer just a contract between lender and borrower. It becomes an extension of political power. A government can sell claims on the future because it controls the mechanisms that extract that future from society. That is why state debt can finance things private debt cannot sustain for long. Prolonged war, imperial administration, frontier defense, and the appearance of continuity even when underlying strength is fading. In that sense, public debt is never only economic. It is a way of converting future taxes, future labor, and future monetary stability into present power, into ships, into armies, into time, and sometimes into the illusion that the center is still stronger than it really is. Britain took the Dutch breakthrough and turned it into imperial scale. After 1694, with the founding of the Bank of England, public debt became more than a wartime tool. It became a permanent structure. The state could borrow again, roll obligations forward, and tie military power to a deepening financial system centered on credit, taxation, and confidence. This was funded debt organized, continuous, and institutional. It gave Britain something older empires often lacked: the ability to fight long wars without first possessing all the metal required to pay for them. Armies could be sustained. Fleets could remain at sea. Imperial competition could continue far longer than treasure alone would have allowed. That was the triumph. But it came with a condition. An empire built on debt had to keep belief alive. Belief in taxation, belief in repayment, belief in the currency, belief that the state would remain stable enough to honor tomorrow. So debt helped Britain expand, but it also turned empire into a machine that had to keep producing fiscal credibility again and again, or risk seeing power itself begin to wobble. And here is the second twist. The very mechanism that makes an empire stronger in one century can become a deadly burden in the next. Because debt is never just power. It is power with a delayed invoice. In the beginning, that invoice can feel almost invisible. Credit extends war, stabilizes government, buys time, preserves reach. It can even look like proof of superior statecraft. But time changes the meaning of borrowed strength. What once financed expansion must later be serviced, defended, and believed in. The system must keep collecting taxes, keep protecting trade, keep maintaining currency credibility, keep convincing creditors that tomorrow will still hold. That is where the weight begins to build. A debt system can help construct empire, but it can also lock empire into obligations that outlive the conditions that first made them manageable. And when that happens, the past does not stay in the past. It returns as pressure, as fragility, as a bill history eventually presents. Bourbon France shows what happens when the bill can no longer be disguised. By the 18th century, war, court expenditure, and the sheer cost of preserving great power status had pushed the monarchy into a familiar trap. The state needed more money than its revenue system could reliably deliver. So it borrowed, again and again, to preserve the surface of order. For a time, that still worked. Officials were paid, armies moved, the court still displayed magnificence, the kingdom still looked governable from a distance. But debt only protects appearances as long as creditors continue to believe. And once that belief begins to thin, the crisis changes its nature. This is the crucial point. A fiscal crisis is never only about numbers, it is about legitimacy. If lenders begin to doubt repayment, they are also beginning to doubt the state itself, its authority, its stability, its capacity to command the future. That is when financial weakness turns political. The foundations crack not only in the treasury, but in the public imagination. And when that happens, power no longer merely looks expensive. It starts to look unconvincing. But debt never remains trapped inside ledgers. Sooner or later, it moves outward, into taxes, into prices, into shortages, into the daily texture of ordinary life. This is where imperial finance stops feeling abstract. A state may borrow in palaces, ministries, or banking rooms. But the cost of sustaining that borrowed power is usually pushed downward onto merchants, facing heavier burdens, workers facing thinner wages, families facing dearer food, and provinces asked to give more while receiving less. That is one of the oldest patterns in financial history. Elites often have buffers. They hold assets. They gain access to court, credit, or protection. They can delay the pain, redirect it, or price it into someone else's future. Ordinary people usually cannot. They meet empire not in theory, but in collection, in inflation, in unstable markets, in the slow erosion of what money can still buy. So debt is never only a matter of state survival. It is also a way of redistributing strain. And very often, the people who pay the highest price are the ones who had the least power in creating the crisis to begin with. By now, the pattern should be visible. Across different centuries, different empires, and very different monetary systems, the sequence keeps returning with almost eerie consistency. First, expansion. More territory, more war, more administration, more promises to uphold. Then rising cost, and sooner or later a familiar gap opens. The real resources of the system: tax capacity, metal reserves, productive strength, public trust no longer grow fast enough to support the scale of imperial ambition. That is when debt begins to matter most. It does not usually create the weakness. It extends a system already under pressure. It buys time. It preserves appearances. It delays recognition. But the extension comes at a price. Money is stretched. Taxes grow heavier. Confidence becomes harder to maintain. Creditors become more important. Ordinary life becomes more fragile. From the outside, power may still look intact. The army still exists. The state still speaks. The flag still flies, but inside, the core is softening. That is the hidden rhythm of imperial decline. Not sudden disappearance, but prolonged maintenance. Not immediate collapse, but slow internal exhaustion financed forward. And this is where the story stops feeling safely historical. Modern states may no longer call themselves empires. Their language is different. Their institutions are different. Their tools are more sophisticated. But the logic is often disturbingly familiar. Persistent deficits. Government bonds rolled forward again and again. Central banks stepping in when pressure rises. Stability maintained not by resolving underlying weakness, but by financing its continuation. In that sense, the modern world may not have escaped the old pattern. It may have refined it. Today, borrowed power rarely arrives dressed in royal ceremony or imperial banners. It arrives through bond markets, liquidity support, monetary intervention, and the quiet assumption that debt can always be extended a little longer. That raises a difficult question. Are modern systems fundamentally different from the empires that came before them? Or have we simply replaced the old language of empire with the newer language of policy, credit, and stabilization? Because if order still depends on selling future claims to preserve present calm, then the structure may be more familiar than we like to admit. Here is the more uncomfortable truth. Modern debt is not used only to build the future. Very often, it is used to postpone the price of the present. That is what makes it so hard to see clearly. Debt can fund investment, yes, but it can also mask weakness. Weakness in productivity, weakness in tools, weakness in the social capacity to absorb more pressure without breaking. When growth loses depth, credit can preserve the appearance of momentum.
Thank you very much.
When incomes stagnate, borrowing can keep demand alive a little longer. When governments cannot solve structural strain fast enough, debt can make the system look more stable than it really is. For a while, this feels like resilience. But sometimes it is something else. Sometimes it is delay. A way of shifting today's strain into tomorrow's balance sheet. A way of protecting the surface while the underlying capacity of society grows thinner, more tired, more fragile. That is why debt can be so politically useful and so historically dangerous. It does not always remove the cost. Sometimes it simply hides where the cost is accumulating. This is where the modern consequence becomes hardest to ignore. Debt does not only shape states, it reshapes the conditions of everyday life. Housing becomes more expensive, not only because homes change, but because credit changes what prices can be. Living costs rise inside systems already stretched by deficits, monetary intervention, and asset inflation. And the gains do not fall evenly. Those with access to cheap capital can often buy earlier, borrow larger, and watch assets climb beneath them. Those who live mainly on wages face a different world. They meet rising prices faster than rising security. They rent longer, save more slowly, absorb more risk, and watch stability move further out of reach. That is not just a personal struggle. It is a structural one. Debt changes who gets time, who gets safety, and who gets leverage over the future. So the real issue is not only how much debt exists, it is how debt reorganizes social position, who is protected by the system, who is exposed to it, and who is asked to carry a future that grows more expensive the longer they wait outside it. And at this point, debt is doing more than keeping governments alive. It is helping keep the entire global financial order in motion. This is the larger shift. When debt becomes the foundation of growth, the real question is no longer whether the system carries a lot of debt. The real question is what happens if the borrowing slows, because now debt supports more than budgets. It supports asset prices. It supports liquidity. It supports trade, credit markets, public spending, and the expectation that tomorrow will remain manageable. That is what makes the structure feel so powerful and so fragile at the same time. A system built on expanding debt can continue functioning for a very long time, but it also becomes dependent on renewal, on rollover, on confidence, on the assumption that credit will remain available when pressure returns. So the hidden fear inside the modern order is not simply that debt is large. It is that so much stability may now depend on never truly stepping away from it. And once that becomes true, the old question changes. Not how much can be borrowed, but what breaks first if borrowing stops. So we return to the central pattern. Empires borrow before they decline because debt gives them something precious in moments of weakness, not victory, not renewal. Time. Time to keep armies paid. Time to keep markets calm. Time to keep institutions speaking in the voice of order. Time to protect the appearance that control still exists. That is why debt can feel so powerful. It does not merely finance a state, it can prolong an illusion, but that is also why debt becomes so revealing. When a political order must keep selling more of tomorrow just to defend the stability of today, that is no longer the posture of confident strength. It is the late confession of a system that cannot fully support itself on present foundations alone. History does not hide this pattern, it repeats it. And the repetition matters because money changes society, not only through wealth, trade, and power, but through the timing of who pays, who waits, who is protected, and who is asked to carry strain forward. Debt tells us something very specific about a civilization. It tells us which societies are still living on earned strength, and which have begun living on borrowed time.